might argue, by the way, as did C.L.R. James, amongst others, of course, in the Caribbean, that this is where modernity was, your North Atlantic modernity was invented, right? I mean, this is the birthplace of global capitalism, right, with the plantation system and this whole commodity economy. But I'm not competent enough to follow that. I think there are three lines of temporality one has to talk about, each of which has enormous diversity in it. So one can talk about the birth of what we now sometimes refer to as North Atlantic modernity, or I call it Euro-modernity. But of course, most people, when they talk about Euro-modernity, they mean Northern Europe and America, and it leaves out Mediterranean modernity, and it leaves out other versions of Euro-modernity. But I think at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that was a new version, a new configuration of Euro-modernity was born. That's what we assume today Euro-modernity is. It's the invention of the public, right? Public education, public services. It's the invention of a certain notion of individual rights. It's the invention of the negotiation between capital and labor, Fordism, which then gets, much of what we think of as sort of modernity is actually liberal modernity as a particular reconfiguration of other forms of Euro-modernity that preceded it, such as in the United States, of course, the South, plantation modernity, in which there was slavery, right? And as a number of commentators have said, it took the overthrow of slavery in order to be able to move on to a different formation. Marx says, the American Civil War is the most important event in the history of capitalism because with the end of slavery, it means the full exploitation of labor, right? Because now you can exploit them. Slavery is a different configuration. So, we have liberal modernity, and one can talk about the political formations of liberal modernity that come to be established in terms of civil society. One can talk about, the economic formations of corporate capitalism. One can talk about the cultural forms in terms of electronically mediated forms, the re-articulation of the nation state that takes place at the end of the 19th and 20th and beginning of 20th century. What I'm trying to get at is the contradictions in the ways in which people's affective lives and people's ideological lives are organized at the moment. Now, having said that, what I didn't say in the earlier work that I would now say is, of course, people's lives, that relationship, or that complex set of relationships, has always been full of contradictions. It's not that it was completely, homogeneous, everything corresponded to everything in the past, and now it's collapsed. But that the contradictions have changed, right? And we need to map out the contradictions. There was a sense of, about contemporary forms of pessimism that seemed to me to resist the kinds of ideological analysis that have traditionally been brought to bear in the realm of a phenomenon of political pessimism and broader social and cultural pessimisms, if you will. That this has traditionally been seen as the product of certain kinds of ideological constructions of reality. And it seemed to me that that wasn't, at least in my efforts to try to analyze it ideologically, it wasn't that way. And so, I went back to this notion that, which is what for me, what I always meant by the postmodern. I never thought we were postmodern, or I thought the postmodern defined the rearticulation of the relationship between the effectivities of discourse. That reconfiguration was what I wanted to call postmodern. And I thought the contemporary forms of cynicism and pessimism that we've been witnessing since the 1980s, probably, they're not about the ideological. They really seem almost to have become, almost, not completely, but almost to have become affective. Now, that doesn't mean they're not produced by discourses, but it means the discourses aren't working to represent the world. Right? They're working to produce an affective formation, right? And avoiding, as it were, the mediation of ideological representation. Okay? And if that's the case, that's a lot more difficult to figure out how to combat, right? Because it really does, it's like, it's sort of like a depression. Depression isn't, you can't cure a depressive by saying the world isn't so bad, because it's not about how they interpret the world. It's about an affective state, which then leads them to see the world rather bleakly, right? So we don't, what I was trying to get at is we don't really have the strategies. One of the things rock and roll, for me, pop music was always about, was the ability to organize affective configurations and the ability to energize. So, no matter how badly you feel, or no matter how pessimistically you feel, rock and roll kind of could transform that, right? Or change it in ways that most fans are sophisticated manipulators. But it didn't seem to be working that way anymore, right? And that, if that was the strength of popular music from the 50s or 40s to the 80s, and probably longer, because I do think Paul Gilroy's analysis of black music, is very good in its relationships. I see myself kind of connected to it. But if pop music or popular music wasn't working, didn't seem to be able to do that now, it seemed to be working differently, then it seemed like we had a real dilemma, right? And I still think we do. We have a real dilemma. And it is, it's also why I think Obama's rhetoric of hope trumps everything. With the possible exception of the brouhaha taking place in America now about is he changing his position on the war, Obama's popularity is all about affect, right? And his enormous ability. So when Clinton says, but this hope is completely empty, right? There's no content to his rhetoric of hope. What she doesn't understand is that's exactly the point, right? Because it's a pure affective appeal, right? And for that reason, I kind of like Obama, because I think he did, for a moment, find a way to connect into what I was calling postmodern pessimism, right? And any attempt to put content into it, as it were, would have rendered it incapable of doing it, because it would have brought it back into the realities of the ideological world in which you say, well, no, actually I don't think you can do that, or in fact you and I disagree, or all of that was irrelevant, right? It was, yes, we can. Yeah, we can what? It doesn't matter. I don't want you to tell me what we can do. The point is, yes, we can change the world. Don't tell me how you want to change it. We just can change it. It doesn't have to be the way it is. A pure, affective appeal. So I think that's kind of what I was getting at. Does that help?
Thank you very much, Larry.
My pleasure.